Sunday school leader. It is a cold, brisk day here in Southeast Arkansas. Let's look ahead. Let's see what's coming up this Sunday. Remember, we're in the unit that's entitled Finding Meaning, Wisdom from Ecclesiastes. We're in the second week. It's called The Problem with Pleasure, out of Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. And the point of the lesson is that pleasures and possessions don't offer lasting joy. So even though this lesson is about the problem of pleasure, we also get a little preview in these verses about work and wealth in this passage as well. Those are subjects that will be coming up in later weeks. Now, the version I usually use, the Bible version I usually use while teaching is the NIV, the New International Version. So what I'm about to say may or may not match exactly with what Bible version you use. So the first four words in our text, Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 1, says, I said to myself. And that's part of the problem here with Solomon and his searching for meaning. It's all about me. All right. I counted in just these 11 verses, the word I was used 18 times. The word my was used 8 times. Myself 4 times. Me 4 times. So you might want to verify that. Even if you use NIV, just go through and count to make sure I didn't miscount. All right. So still looking in verse 1, he says, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. Now, pleasure there, at least in our modern day, when we hear that, our minds might shift towards sexual pleasure. And while that's part of it, the word generally means happiness. All right. And there again, there's another problem here, and that is people are seeking happiness instead of joy. I think we've talked about this before, that happiness is short-term. Happiness depends on our circumstances, depends on what's going on around us. Our circumstances change. Happiness comes and goes. It's like a roller coaster. Depending on what we have and our health and circumstances, we can be riding pretty high and then something happens, lose a job or get sick or whatever. You know, we just take that roller coaster ride of happiness. But joy to me is that bedrock that's underneath it all, and it doesn't waver. Okay, joy, you can experience joy in a funeral. You can be sad, right? You can be not happy at the funeral of a believer, yet retain that underlying joy that a relationship with Christ brings. So as we look here in these few verses following here, what are some of the pleasures that he mentions? Well, he mentions laughter, wine, and just folly. Now I want you to note that through all this, Solomon kept his mind about him. He was still guided by his search for wisdom. He kept his senses. He had his wits about him. Anyone knows that living the life of a drunkard leads to nowhere. And so Solomon knew not to go down that road and just totally be absorbed by wine, women, and song, or as we would say today, drugs, sex, and rock and roll. But he wanted to see if rationally controlled indulgence gave meaning to life. So even though he indulged in wine, he didn't go lead a life of a drunkard. All right. And of course, he answers that it did not bring him satisfaction, did not give him meaning of life. This kind of reminds me of the 1970s beer commercial. And I don't know, can I mention a beer commercial in a Southern Baptist Church Sunday school lesson? Yeah, probably so. At least I can. You only go around once in life. So you've got to reach for all the gusto you can. Go for the gusto or don't go at all. And that's kind of what Solomon's doing here. He's going for it all. He's going for the gusto. This in the 70s, this was kind of the forerunner of YOLO, Y-O-L-O, or You Only Live Once, which became popular a few years ago. All right, we look down to verses 4 through 11, and we see that he tries to amass possessions. He gets houses and vineyards and gardens and parks and reservoirs and servants and livestock, silver, gold, concubines. And what's the conclusion of having all that stuff? Vanity, meaningless. Didn't add anything to the overall purpose of life. I read a lot of stories on the internet about lottery winners, and so many of those people don't know how to handle their money, and they would spend it on themselves, vacations, homes, cars, all that stuff. Oftentimes would get into drugs and gambling and lose it all. And then others were very generous, gave to charities, churches, universities, and all that. But even then, so many of all those people ended up broke. One big lotto winner ended up working as a maid, and while there's nothing at all wrong with that, it's just amazing to think that you go from a multimillionaire to working for almost, close to minimum wage when you had it all. Okay, having stuff, having even money, doesn't ensure happiness, and it doesn't even ensure that you're going to have the stuff after all. In fact, most said that it was the worst thing that ever happened to them and their family was to win that lottery. Well, you've heard the saying, I'm sure, that money can't buy happiness. I'm going to disagree with that, okay? I think money can buy happiness because, like I said before, happiness is temporary. So I can buy the car or buy the wine or buy the lotto ticket and win. I can buy happiness because happiness is fleeting. Happiness is the roller coaster up and down. Money can buy happiness. Money cannot buy joy. All right? It cannot buy meaningful satisfaction in the long run. Now, do you know the name Carlos Irwin Estevez? You may better know him as Charlie Sheen. Now, he checked into rehab about 7 years ago, and it was reported the 6 months before checking into rehab, he had spent $500,000 just in those 6 months on drugs and escort girls. Truly chasing after the wind, right? Trying to buy happiness, couldn't find it. All right, well, what's the opposite of foolishness? Well, it's wisdom. Well, what about that? Well, that's what Solomon's going to try next, and that's going to be in next week's lesson, the problem with wisdom. A couple of personal observations here. To me, it's good that nothing under the sun brings us ultimate satisfaction. And why is that? Well, this keeps us longing for more. And this should point us to a joy-based relationship with God. Philip Yancey, in his book Rumors of Another World, or What on Earth Are We Here For? It addresses that topic, so you might want to check that out. Also, if you can remember back February 17th, just a few weeks ago, we had that lesson on when materialism consumes, and I made a reference to 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 through 17, that it basically says everything in the world, lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, and the pride of life, does not come from God. And I applied that verse to the temptation of Eve and to the temptation of Jesus and to us today, how that just, that's basically Satan's tactics, and it never has changed. I also believe this can be applied here as well. Everything in the world. That's what 1 John says. How does it say that in Ecclesiastes? Everything under the sun. Everything under the sun, everything in this world. How about lust of the eyes? What's that? That's the appetites. How did Solomon try to address this temptation? Well, through sex, stimulants, harems, wines. In fact, he said, "I refused my heart no pleasure." How about lust of the eyes? That's stuff. Well, we see here, and we'll see in future lessons as well, how he amassed buildings and gardens and silver and gold and all that other stuff we talked about earlier. Then there's the pride of life. What's that? Well, that's the wanting others to view you in such high esteem. And like I said earlier, just those first 11 verses were all those usages of the word I, me, myself, my, all of those. And he said, I became far greater than anyone in Jerusalem. So there's that pride of life that's there. So there again, I think that can be applied here, that it's just the basic temptations of life that Solomon sought after. If you want to refer back to those previous lessons, that was February 17th of this year, 2019. Also June 18th lesson, 2018. You can go back and look at that. And I think it's about the first six and a half minutes or so of that prep talk address this verse in particular. So just remember, it is always foolish to try to substitute stuff for contentment or for joy. All right. Well, thank you guys for watching. Don't forget to pray for your class and try to stay warm. Hey, thanks for watching today. If you would like to be notified when new Prep Talks are published, you can subscribe to this YouTube channel or follow Prep Talk on Facebook. Of course, you can always email me any questions or comments you have to this email address right here.